Hello everybody, I'm Art, ex-family scapegoat, ex-black sheep, and always and forever the problem child with the evil character, or at least according to my family lore. If you're a returning viewer and you wanted a little update on how I'm doing after last week's video, well, I'm doing well. Because the recent events that happened gave me huge validation that pretty much confirms everything that I've come to understand about scapegoating. And so this gave me an even stronger resolve, to try and pass on this message and to validate, your experiences and the experiences of every single scapegoat who is suffering right now because of their narcissistic family system. Last week's experience inspired today's video and today's deep dive into how the so-called good parent, the one who quietly stands by your abuser and does nothing to protect you, actually adopts a narcissistic viewpoint if they're not narcissistic to begin with. And why it's so important in your healing to wake up from the trance, the spell of this good parent. And so in this video, I'm going to share exactly how I got fooled and how I came to believe that there was a good parent in my life, and that maybe, I thought, a very small part of me once thought, that if the abuser was out of the picture, there maybe there will be a small chance of something real, of actually having a family. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I grew up with an antagonistic, verbally, physically, and psychologically abusive mother who called herself the victim. That was her main defense mechanism, that was her manipulation tactic, and that's how she got away with everything that she's ever done. And I've been no contact for many years because when I finally set my last boundary, after, post-traumatic CPTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, panic disorder, anxiety, and so on, I set my final boundary. And when I did that, basically the rest of my family, my father and my brother, abandoned me. They completely cut me out of their life at that point because they would not accept that I would set a boundary with her, even though I made it very clear to them that I wanted to have a relationship with them, to just please respect the fact that I couldn't have a relationship with her. And why force me? Why? If you see how dysfunctional the whole thing is and how much pain, why? Why force? But that's what it was. And recently something unexpected happened. I received a visit from my father after many years of no contact, in which he came to tell me that my mother is on her deathbed, on her final hour, and that she is dying, now, And that visit was extremely eye-opening because after so many years of no contact, it brought up things within me that I haven't faced in a very long time. My focus has always been my mother, because I was her scapegoat, because she was the overtly abusive one. You didn't need to be a psychologist to see that something was deeply, deeply wrong with that woman. And I personally believe that her personality disorder was a symptom of something bigger, or there was other issues mixed in there. But since she never sought professional help, and she, in her heart, truly believed that she was a god, and that everything was everybody else's fault, and that, everything that's ever gone wrong in her life was my fault, she never consulted a professional because, all the answers were there, right? There was no need to consult a mental health professional. She could just continue doing the things she did, as she was enabled by the rest of the family as well. So, because of all this, I believed, a very small part of me believed that my father was the good parent, the quiet one, the one caught in a difficult marriage, just trying to survive my mother's rage and my mother's very deep issues and the constant chaos in the house. And even though deep down inside, there was very little hope that things would ever change. There was always this tiny little door in the back of my mind, like a little mouse door, that maybe if my abuser died first, there might still be a chance of reconciliation. Because a small part of me, that inner child part of me who longed for that family, thought that maybe there was a chance that he was simply trapped in a toxic marriage and he didn't know any better, he didn't know what to do. And so if she was out of the picture, maybe I could actually have a family, And my upbringing was violent. It was unpredictable. It was full of fighting, wall punching, screaming. And while I knew deep down inside that my father wasn't completely healthy either, I told myself that he was just trying to cope, right? So I also saw that he had no real relationship with my brother, who was my mother's golden child. And there was no question about my brother being the golden child because, I'd get beaten for things that he did. And even if he would go up to my mother and admit that he did the thing that she beat me for, she would say, you don't have to lie to protect your sister. That was the dynamic. It was just automatic, And my brother had no relationship with my father. And a part of me assumed it was because my mother had always tried to turn all of us against him all the time. She always spoke so horribly about him every single day. And it was everything for everything, and it was very oftentimes it was inventions that she always invented things about me. And so I would witness her doing the same thing to him. And whenever I tried to defend him, I would get punished, And so I grew up believing that he was misunderstood because she treated him horribly too. And that his distance, with my brother was probably because she had poisoned that relationship as well. But when my father came to visit me, this time to tell me about my mother's death, something happened. And there was verbal aggression, there was shouting, there was rage. And after he left, memories I had long suppressed actually came flooding back, That day, my resolve to see every enabler and as toxic and unsafe was reinforced like 1,000 times over. It already was, but now it's even like more stronger, more powerful. I received this deep internal confirmation that the good parent, I held on to as a child was in truth just as toxic, if not narcissistic. Any tiny doubts I still had were completely erased that day. And that clarity has only resolved me to speak the truth even more. So before I go on, I want you to know something about me, as I share this, is that I'm very transparent about my internal process. I talk about my emotions and what moves through me and what I experience as I do. Well, because I'm human and you're human, and this is, just a part of our humanity, right? To have these experiences. But, keep in mind that I'm speaking from a safe place and a safe space. And, I'm not speaking through this heaviness or depression. I'm speaking through the lens of healthy emotional processing. I've made many videos where I share what that process looks like and how to move through these difficult, excruciating realizations. And my hope every time is that you feel validated as I do this. So after last week's event, I started writing down the memories that came rushing back. And I chewed through my nails in the process, But it is what it is, right? They'll grow back and we move on, So first, I want to share with you, my father was a showman, very active in his community. When I was a child and a teenager, he used me as part of his act, and I was his prop. I performed for his shows, and he gave me attention for as long as I was useful to him. And I mistook that for love. These memories made me realize that I wasn't just my mother's scapegoat, but I was actually also my father's golden child. So when I hit my teenage years and I wanted to stop performing and being cute, for him, I remembered guilt trips, and I also remember the attention stopping completely if I wasn't performing. There was zero interest in what I was doing unless it had to do with some sort of performance for him. And that's the first sign of grandiose narcissism. Love is performance, right? And I mistook that for, a bond, an attachment, something, love, right? Now, the second thing that fooled me was the quiet. Because even when he stopped paying attention to me, I equated that with love, because there was no chaos, there was no antagonism, When my mother wasn't home, the house was peaceful. He minded his own business, I minded mine, and I confused that absence of chaos with good parenting. I'm Polish by origin, but I don't live in Poland, I'm in Canada, and, and I was born in South America, so, I never I met them once, but I'll get into that in a second. I never got to experience a bond with any relatives. My mother traveled to Poland to visit her family on a regular basis, and I was never invited as a child, as a teenager. I never had a chance to really know my aunties, uncles, or cousins. I was always kept completely isolated, and those family trips were just for her to see the family, like, without me. And, my father, on the other hand, never visited his family unless once, and it was for work. And only once, when I was a young teen, did he bring the rest of us along on that trip, and that was a business trip. It was a performing trip, and there was an image to uphold on that trip. And that was the only time that I ever met any relatives at all. And, I shook their hands. I was a young teen. I shook their hands, and, there was a few things that happened, but that's not the point of today's video, so I'm going to move on. I never saw them again after that. Meanwhile, my mother would make it a personal sport, to smear my name over the phone to family members when they would call for Christmas or birthdays, or just a phone call like that. She would just constantly smear my name. She always spoke so horribly about me to family members and my father never stepped in. He never defended me. He never told her to stop. So when I became an adult, I didn't know what family was, really. I mean, I always kept to myself. My father was never home, and she was going nuts in the house, just being incredibly abusive. And so I basically raised myself, and my brother being older than me, when I hit teenagehood, he moved out already, and he married into a wealthy family, so everything was nicely forgotten on his end, And so when I became an adult, I had no idea what family was, and yet my father always talked about family, in this sort of delusional, performative way, family, 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 like where, Looking back, I can see that this version of family, it was never about love or about protection or about connection or those normal things that you experience in a family. It was only about appearances, about keeping the facade, but while sacrificing the truth of what was actually happening inside our home. And honestly, who knows what was happening, beyond our home as well. Because he certainly acted like his family didn't matter to him. There was no trips to Poland. There was no contact. He never introduced me, except for that one time when it was because of a performance, to his relatives. There was nothing, And so, to me, that entire side of the family just didn't exist, And yet, family, what? Like what, And another thing that I completely repressed were the moments of violence, because he was never physically violent towards my mother, but there were a handful of times with us kids, with me and my brother, and mostly when we were younger. So it was really a lot easier to put those in the back of my mind, because my mother's violence was really in full effect every day, all the time, And What persisted though on his end was rage, the shouting matches, whenever if there was too much noise or something happened that he didn't like, there was no talking. It was just him coming out of the basement, and like there was wall punching. There was screaming so loud that you could hear him at the end of the road. His face would get red and poofy, and he would almost like spit, and his fists were clenched, And of course, as a child and young teen, it felt like the whole house was shaking when that was happening, But for years, I told myself that he was like that because she kept pushing him to the brink. And so I thought, I rationalized that he was reacting to her chaos. And that's why this was happening. At that point, I had become extremely reactive towards my mother too, because she was always antagonizing me. And then when I would get a reaction, she would demonize me. So when I would see my father, I would put those things together in my mind, They simply fed off of each other's complete toxicity. And nothing has ever stopped him from leaving her, really, when you think about the role of the good parent in the house, If he had left her, she would have probably just gone back to Poland, and he could have had, the peace that he wanted, right? But that wasn't his choice. He chose to stay. He chose to not face anything, not to address the dysfunction, not to deal with his wife's abuse, not to protect his children. He chose to avoid, to deny, and then to deny some more. He chose not to have a relationship with his son, all while talking to me about family, And meanwhile, the chaos in the house just went on and on and on and on. Now, the part that brought me the most confusion about this link that I had with him would be the fact that he would comfort me sometimes when I cried. And his version of comforting me was twisted, because he'd say things like, I know she's crazy with me too, you just have to take it and, let her get it out of her system. You know how she is, she just needs to let it out. And everything is fine the next day. If I can take it, you should take it too, because we're family, and that's what family does. And that's what he would do. And he would even show me videos of like when I was a baby, and he was obsessed with taking videos, and he would edit them to make it look like everything was so happy. And he was always doing like walking around with the camera. It was actually really like, at some point, outsiders were starting to wonder why was he so obsessed about filming things, Of course, it was all about the image that he wanted to show to the world through social media and other things, Now, the part of me that felt the most confusion growing up will be that part where I knew that he could comfort me, that he would actually comfort me. And I saw that even though it was twisted form of comfort, I still saw it as him sitting down with me and comforting me, And this is exactly how narcissistic family systems normalize abuse and dysfunction, The enablers are the key players here, They keep the scapegoat accessible to the main abusive parent, and they do it with kindness. They do it with manipulation. They can do it through religion, through morality, by triangulating you, by gaslighting you in very subtle ways, And I clung to that, to those rare moments, like they were proof that he was good. But what I now see is that I was confused, and I was desperate. I didn't want to be alone. I did not want to be alone, And I ended up being manipulated into compliance, through him. Now, when a family revolves around a narcissistic parent, it can function without both roles, okay? You have to have the overt aggressor and the covert stabilizer. Now, in psychology and family systems theory, the good parent or the quiet parent, the good parent, will often appear healthier, but it's only by contrast, because functionally they actually tend to share many of the same narcissistic traits that the abusive parent does, only they're expressed passively and in covert ways. So, a part of this shared core, for example, is the lack of empathic responsibility. Even if the good parent isn't overtly cruel towards you, they usually actually lack true empathy for your emotional reality. They may see the abuse, but they won't intervene. And even if they do occasionally intervene, they don't actually do anything about it. They don't change it. They rationalize it. They normalize it. They will talk about family and forgiveness without there being any meaningful consequence, without there being any accountability. And that's not neutrality. That's emotional neglect 101, nothing else. And what their silence is telling you is that your pain isn't their responsibility as a parent, and your pain is your own responsibility because of your character, because you're too reactive to, because you're too reactive to your abuser, because you don't tiptoe enough, so it's your own damn fault, because you keep, doing things to bring it onto yourself. That's how they behave. That's how they talk to you. And that's how they normalize abuse. And again, I spoke about this before, but this is a narcissistic defense, They protect their self-image from, they protect themselves, their self-image from the guilt of acknowledging harm and dysfunction. In healthy parenting, empathy creates action. Real empathy will create real, concrete action. In narcissistic family systems, empathy is selectively applied. It's used only when it doesn't threaten the comfort or that parent's identity, their role in the family. The good parent, is often deeply invested in maintaining the family's external image. So just like my father, they may see themselves as the peacemakers or the martyr or, the one who holds everything together, the wise one. But that identity depends on denying and minimizing the abuse. So they might say, don't upset your mother, she means well. My father used to always tell me, you have no idea how much she worries about you when you're not home. She worries about you, And another thing he would do would be to try and make her seem absolutely normal and the situation absolutely normal. There was a time in my life when I had a back surgery and the surgery didn't go well, and I nearly passed away during that surgery. It's a whole story. And then I was living abroad when I went through that surgery. And so, my father called me to ask me how I'm doing, and he was keeping in touch, right? So I thought, okay, he loves me, because then I would ask him, what about mom? How come she's not coming to the phone? Where's mom? Where is she? And he would tell me, she doesn't have to come to the phone. If I call, I speak on behalf of both of us. And he was doing that because she was giving me the silent treatment over something ridiculous that she invented. I was living abroad and I called her and she didn't I was like, how are you or whatever, and she was stressed about something, and my tone of voice made her, she literally reacted because she thought my tone of voice wasn't caring enough, even though I was just talking normally. Hi, how are you, And then she gave me the silent treatment for something ridiculous, she hadn't been speaking to me for some time during that period, and when I had my surgery, she still didn't speak to me, and that's how my father responded, So, their self-worth basically comes from appearing functional, and it doesn't come from being truthful, or from acknowledging what's going on, or from protecting you. It comes from appearing as the one who sort of keeps everything calm and cool and keeps the family together, And this mirrors narcissistic preoccupation with reputation and control of perception. They will behave as if they are morally superior through their passivity, See, I'm not reacting like you, I'm taking it and I'm behaving calm and peaceful about this because I'm the bigger person. See how good and how wise I am? Look at me, Their calm is actually built on your suffering, on someone else's suffering. That's a form of narcissistic morality, appearing virtuous without taking any actual concrete moral action. And in scapegoating systems, both parents will unconsciously agree, on who the problem child is, because then their alignment on that keeps them bonded. So the overtly abusive parent will express their rage openly, and then the good parent will provide this quiet validation for that rage by not stopping it. And together, they will maintain the illusion that the child is the issue and it has nothing to do with them and their worldview and the chaos that they are creating in the house. Now, if the scapegoat resists any of this, the good parent will align with the abuser at the end of the day, and that's not confusion on their part, that's alignment with pathology, okay? Their emotional survival depends on you continuing to carry the dysfunction, because if you don't, then the truth unravels, and they can't handle the truth. They don't want the truth. They don't want to hear the truth. And that leads to emotional avoidance, and that's refusing to engage with painful truths because it threatens their sense of control and goodness, The good parent will detach. They will intellectualize and spiritualize, reality, talking about forgiveness and family unity and don't dwell on the past, But that detachment is not actually emotional maturity. It's a form of control. It's a way to keep you in line. And by staying detached from what's really going on, they maintain authority over what is acceptable truth. And that's why when the scapegoat speaks the truth, the good parent may become cold, distant, or like what happened to me recently, enraged. Because you've broken that illusion of control. They can't control you anymore. They can't control the narrative anymore. And so the truth actually comes out. The truth always comes out when you set boundaries. When you set healthy boundaries for yourself, that's when you really see the truth. They will share a sense of entitlement over how family members should feel or behave about the actual, main abuser in the house. So when you go no contact, they will take it personally, as if your boundary was actually an attack on them. And that entitlement, of your over your emotions, over how you feel, over your reality, over your experiences, is another narcissistic feature, The assumption that your inner world exists to preserve their comfort. Your job is to serve them. Your job is to help them normalize that fake illusion, that family image they're trying so hard to maintain, Your job is to do what you're told. So when I set my boundary, with my father's unwanted visit, he erupted in rage the second that he realized that he could no longer control me. He could not get me to behave in the way he wanted me to and the way that I always have, because I always broke when he did this in the past. That was always how I went back into the system. It was always through him, And when I refused to take that inheritance from him, which was bait, he knew that he had lost complete control over me. So yeah, Dad, I'm not taking your blood money. You can keep it. I have integrity. And, I rather preserve my safety and my mental health and be happy being a little bit poor, and that's okay. I can take good care of myself. And so, this boundary is going to be called crazy for sure, because the smear campaign is going to come, and the enablers are a huge part of the smear campaign. They are a part of it, because that's why it's called a system. That's why you end up isolated and alone, because they create a system and they use that system and they expand that system. I'm going to talk about that in future videos, to make you feel like you're absolutely going insane. And the family's denial of everything that's going on isn't just them being cowards, but it's sort of this self-worship in disguise, The good parent or siblings or whoever is involved, they refuse to see the truth, not because they can't. I mean, many of them saw the abuse. They've seen it, they know it. But admitting to it would collapse this cherished self-image as the reasonable ones, the stable ones, the good ones, the calm ones, the wise ones, So they will project that responsibility outward. I did my best. It's not my problem. You're remembering things wrong, right, guys? You're remembering things wrong. They did their best, Oh, and you're so bitter, right? And you're so angry. You're the problem. And that projection preserves their narcissistic defense. I am the good one. I am the good one. So, in short, that good parent in a narcissistic family is either a covert narcissist, an enabling narcissist, or at least they will adopt a narcissistic viewpoint. And whether they can ever snap out of it, well, I have experienced proof recently that doesn't really happen. So I wouldn't hold my breath. And the truth is, I always knew that my father wasn't healthy, but I held on to this quiet hope that maybe one day, if my mother was out of the picture, something in him would wake up. Maybe he could come around and finally see things clearly, That maybe he would look at me someday and say, I understand what you went through, and I was her target too, and I couldn't bring myself to leave her, and maybe we can have a relationship, Maybe for once there could be peace, the kind that comes from truth and accountability and validation, not avoidance and denial, But when he showed up at my door years later, right, after I went no contact and after he abandoned me, I got the validation that I needed, And now my peace has expanded times 1,000, guys. I feel good. It's not the kind of peace in which my family has healed. Of course, that will never happen. But it's the kind of peace that really ended any remaining doubt, in my mind. Anything left over, any doors have been shut now, because now I got closure, really. Not from them validating my pain, but from being no contact for a long time and then having this interaction that was very quick and then seeing how nothing's changed despite her death. Nothing has changed, And that realization did came. I mean, initially when he showed up, I wasn't shocked, because I've been in a safe space for a long time, but it really sort of helped. Like there was a click in my mind, and sort of all the fragments, everything sort of nicely aligned into place, When there is no concrete change, when there is no real protection of the scapegoat, when both parents, the sibling, the grandparents, any family member that jumps on the train of enabling the abuser and minimizing your experience, they're part of that machine. They are part of that same machine, and you will not find safety there, The scapegoat's role is to absorb the shame. The golden child reflects the family glory, and both serve the same illusion. Okay, the so-called good parents sustains the illusion by appearing sane next to the chaos. And their entire image depends on their partner's madness and on making you look just as sick as your abuser. The way that they can discredit you while continuing to play the role of the wise and reasonable one. This is something that you have to pay attention to. When my father showed up and my husband asked him to leave, words were exchanged while they were outside, I'm not going to share everything here in one shot because every single thing my father said that day deserves its own video. Deserves a deep dive, so I can talk to you guys about the mindset of these family systems, But one line I'm going to share now that stood out was when he said to my husband, she has hysteria, talking about me. She's hysteric. She's been crazy since she was a child. And my husband replied, actually, she's really, really healthy. She's a good wife. She's a good mother. She works. She's happy. When your wife is not in the picture, she can actually, be her normal, healthy, happy self. And she's doing as well as she's ever been. And we intend on keeping it that way. I mean, that was great. And that, made my father so angry. He was offended. My husband told me, that my father was like, what do you mean she's doing well? She's not, he was basically saying she's not supposed to be well. She's crazy, And then after trying to pressure my husband to take the money from my mother's will, my husband said no, my wife said no. So that's her boundary and that stands. And then my father turned around and told my husband, well, you know what? You guys owe me money with interest for all the things I ever helped you with. So he pulled that card next, And then my husband calmly replied, don't forget that we also helped you many times, There was also times that we stepped in to help you guys. So, if you want to have this discussion, that's absolutely fine. We can do it in court. Give us your number. We'll give you ours, and we can just take it from there. No problem, sir. No problem. I mean, in this world, in his world, in this narcissistic family system world, I'm not supposed to be doing well. I'm supposed to be miserable, just like my mother was, and just like he is. I'm supposed to be miserable. I'm supposed to be scared. I'm supposed to grovel in shame. I'm supposed to be, just like, this nothing. They don't actually want you to be healthy. They don't want you to heal or thrive, because when you do, the whole illusion falls apart. Everything they've ever said about you falls apart. Everything that they ever did, everything. When you're healthy and you rebuild your life for yourself, everything that they've ever told themselves falls completely apart. And I think in a strange way, I was waiting to see who he would be without her in the picture before permanently, really fully closing that door 100%. My father's silence all these years wasn't a sign of love. It was, he was participating in the delusion of the narcissistic family system. And I was his golden child for some time, which made it more difficult to see. And this is how dysfunctional families operate. And that's why the scapegoat, the one that everyone blames, is actually the only one capable of healing this generational wound and stopping the generational trauma from moving on, from continuing and being passed on, And healing doesn't mean necessarily reconciling with people who harmed you at all, or even forgiving them at all. You don't have to do that. It means reconciling with yourself the parts of you that had to split off to survive, the child who learned to anticipate every mood and who lives in fear, the teenager who reacted with anger, or he blamed themselves, for not being stronger, who blamed themselves, the adult who still wonders if they overreacted, if they're doing something wrong. You bring every part of you home, one by one. You learn to speak gently to those parts of you that were never spoken to gently. You teach yourself that love can exist without fear, that safety can exist, without silence, that peace can exist without you pretending anymore, because peace is not about pretending. And little by little, you build a life, where you don't have to disappear to feel safe. And that's true liberation of the scapegoat, is realizing that you don't have to keep proving your innocence with crazy people. You don't have to keep proving your innocence to anybody that enables that stuff, You were never the villain in your story, and you have to learn to feel that in your heart, You were the witness of some crazy shit, okay? But now, you become the author of your own story. They don't get to dictate what you know happened to you. And they never will. They will never validate you, you know? And if you step back, the longer you step back and you look at the whole thing, it's a circus. The whole thing is a circus with a ringmaster, you know? And there's the clowns, and there's people jumping through hoops, and there's lion taming. It's a circus. The whole thing is mad. So when you step back, you look at it and you go, man, why would I want validation from any of that? Forget that. Forget that. I create my own world of safety. I create my own peace. There comes a point where you know that you have to stop trying to earn the peace. You start creating it for yourself. You start working on bringing yourself to a safe space. And I know that takes time if you're not there, especially since so many of us will struggle financially. There's so many reasons why we can't, always leave the system when we want to. But keeping that goal in mind and taking tiny little micro steps, tiny things that you can do every day to get there is the most important thing that you can focus on. Don't look at the whole mountain ahead, okay? Because the whole mountain is overwhelming, but you can look at the tiny little step that you can take here and there every day. First I do this, okay, now I'm gonna do this, now I'm gonna do this. And you do that step by step as you bring yourself to safety. And remember that healing is becoming your own safe parent. You become your own home. And from there, once you start really feeling that, everything changes. So remember, I love myself, I trust myself. Repeat that mantra. Repeat it as often as you can. And I'm gonna see you guys soon.